Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi to Ask Zajef Nahida edition with 431 ping. Woohoo! Oh, going down? No. Okay, never mind. Yeah, we can just get straight into it. First question. What's our overall place in the meta? Pull value, especially compared to the other 3.6 5 stars and Dendro 5 stars. And how much did she impact Dendro in the overall meta upon her release in 3.2? And how much has changed, if at all, with her since then? Okay, let's take these one at a time. First off, what's her overall place in the meta? She's very good. She's one of those units that, like, if you're pulling units for pull value only, she's probably one that you're going to want to get at some point. And as such, her pull value is also quite high. One thing that I do want to point out is that while Nahida is very good, people still very much underestimate some of the other Dendro options because of how good she is, and they end up feeling like they have to get Nahida to make their teams work, even if they don't. Which, like, if you want to get Nahida, that's completely fine. But a lot of people don't want to get her because they don't like playing child models, or think that her kit is boring, or they don't want to get the Archons, or for any reason why you might not want to get her. If you decide not to get Nahida, it doesn't make the Dendro teams unplayable. Generally, she is an upgrade in Dendro teams, but she's not necessary for most of the Dendro teams to work. Dendro main character is still a very solid unit in basically almost any team that Nahida can be used, and there are a few outliers where Dendro MC is actually better than Nahida for a few specific reasons, but generally Nahida is like better than Dendro MC. She is overall a very good unit. I just don't want people to feel like they have to get Nahida if they want to make their Dendro teams work, right? You don't, and if you don't like her, like, don't go for a unit you don't like. That being said, yes, she is the best Dendro unit. She's the one that fits in the most comps. She's the one that has the least requirements, right? Her burst can be good, but if you don't use your burst, that's fine. Yeah, you want to use it, and you want to be able to use it, but if you can't, then that's that, and you can't, and that's okay. Because she still has her Dendro application even if you don't use her burst, right? Her Dendro application is completely tied to her skill, which means that her burst is a nice thing, a nice buff, right? A nice EM buff for your on-fielder, but it's not necessary for her to be able to fulfill her main role in teams. That makes it so that generally she is going to feel easier to play because you don't have to worry about ER requirements as much than the Dendro alternatives that do rely on their burst. Compared to the other 3.6 5 stars, so who do we have in 3.6? We have Nilo, Baizhu, and we have Ganyu, right? Ganyu is overall a fine unit, but she's not like a powerhouse. She's not a unit that like you'd really be wanting to get strictly because of meta reasons. She does have her advantages. Specifically in this Abyss, she's actually pretty good because the We Notice cringe. Baizhu, I mean, I've put out the pre-release already, but he's overall a strong unit, but there are many teams where what he does isn't much of an upgrade over Yao Yao. And then finally, you've got Nilo, who is honestly a good unit, but really, Nilo's not the same if you don't have Nahida. Nilo with Nahida and Nilo without Nahida feel like two completely different things. And while if you really don't like Nahida, you can play Nilo teams without her. If you're like strictly going from a meta perspective, I think that Nahida would always be a priority over Nilo because Nilo's teams really like having Nahida. And compared to the other Dendro 5 stars, like overall, I guess you would compare her to Al-Haytham and Tafneri. I mean, both of them, like, they're units that have on-field damage, right? Whereas Nahida is mostly off-field damage. So they kind of fulfill different roles, but because Nahida has such good Dendro application, then she can actually be used as an on-fielder for the teams that mainly want to have the Dendro unit for their application rather than only their damage, right? So when you're looking at Bloom teams, Hyper Bloom teams, Virgin teams, Nahida can be used as an on-fielder and will often do a better job of it than Al-Haytham or Tefnari would because she still has some presence when you swap out of her. And her application is just really good. That being said, in teams where your on-fielder is also focused on damage, so quicken teams, stuff like that, then Al-Haytham and Tefnari can perform better than she does. As a general rule though, she's definitely the best Dendro 5-star. Best Dendro unit overall. How much did she impact Dendro in the overall meta upon her release in 3.2 and how much has changed, if at all, with her since then? I've talked quite often recently about how Dendro has like raised the floor for teams. I would say that if it wasn't for Nahida, it would have been a fairly like balanced floor raise, right? Just overall kind of, you know, like Dendra teams having higher floor but lower ceiling, and like it being just like, okay, well that's how it's balanced, and that's fine. Nahida has taken that floor and raised it even higher, and also taken that, like, those team ceilings and raised that higher, making it so that I would say now that like Dendra teams tend to be the better teams in the game. Obviously that's with the set of criteria that I use, which puts a lot of emphasis on floor and on how well a team performs at somewhat low investment. Keep that in mind and take it with a tiny little grain of salt. But yeah, I would say that like Nahida is definitely a pretty significant part of why that is, and why I would generally consider the Dendra teams to be the better ones right now. How much has changed with her since 3.2? I mean, I guess in teams where you want a healer, sometimes you would pick Yao Yao over Nahida, but like, it's not much of a change. I guess you have a few more options for Quicken teams that don't use Nahida with Alhaitham, but I'd say that things mostly didn't change for Nahida, because I'd say that there are as many Quicken teams with Alhaitham that like you use Alhaitham instead of Nahida, as there are Quicken teams with Alhaitham where you want to use Alhaitham with Nahida. Can you briefly reiterate why no unit is a must pull, as she gets that distinction quite often? Yeah, the reason why I don't like calling units must pull, and why I repeat often that no unit is a must pull, is because at the end of the day, it's a game, and it's a game where the hardest content does not require having the highest investment. It's not a game that has exponentially difficult content, including stuff that hasn't been cleared by anyone yet, right? Like the quote-unquote endgame content does not require endgame investment. Because of that, it means that you can get away with inferior teams incredibly easily, given that they're built well enough. I'm not saying that you're gonna want to play teams that are like actively bad, but if you don't have the right unit to make a team work, to make an archetype like at its best, you can play a slightly inferior version of that and it won't be a problem most of the time. Because of that, there's never gonna be like a must. You never need to pull for a unit, because why do you need it? Like, when there's a need that you have, it's because there's something that you need to do with it. And there's just not that factor in Genshin, which means that no unit can be a must pull, because you can clear the content with Xiangling, right? Like that's where the Xiangling thing came out. Right now, obviously that doesn't mean that you shouldn't pull for a unit just because they're not a must pull. And a lot of people hear that and they get angry because they want to pull for a unit and they don't like being told that they don't have to. And it's like, it's missing the point. You can if you want, but it's nice to know that you don't have to, that your ceiling's not gonna fall on your head if you decide to skip her. You're not gonna end up being stuck on Abyss 11 if you don't. And mentioning that, in my opinion, is pretty important whenever you talk about strong characters, right? Like, at the end of the day, you can clear Abyss without that much investment, which means that eventually you'll have cleared Abyss and you won't have any new content left to do. And at that point, if playing the strongest team isn't how you have fun, if you have fun by playing a specific unit that you really like, then pulling for the strongest unit that does not work with the unit that you really like will have been a waste of Primogems for you. So just keep that in mind whenever talking about like strong characters. Yeah, characters being strong is nice and it's cool, and like it's good to know if they're strong, but them being strong doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go for them or anything like that. If you were coming into this video trying to find an excuse not to go for her because you don't like her, that probably means that you don't want to go for her. Just trust your feelings and just skip if that's the case. Another reason why it's, in my opinion, pretty important to reiterate that no unit is a must pull, and not just helpful but actually important, is because this is a gacha game. Its monetization is based around creating gambling addicts and milking them. Like that's what gacha games try to do. And so I don't want to feed into it, and I don't want to be a part of the reason why someone pulls for a unit because they feel like they have to. If you want to get her and you don't have the Primogems for her, she'll get a rerun eventually. She's an Archon. They're not gonna like not rerun her. And you don't like absolutely need to have her either. Do any units increase in pull value if you have Nahida and decrease if you don't? I mean, yes, obviously any units that like are good in Hyperbloom teams, actually any units that are good in Dendra teams can potentially increase in value if you have Nahida. For example, Nilo increases a lot in value if you have Nahida versus if you don't. Cyno is like a little weird because Nahida is very good for Cyno, but if you're dealing with multi-wave content, when you kill the first wave, Nahida's E was on the enemies that you killed. It's not going to be on the enemies that just spawned, which means that you'll have to swap out of Cyno, which is going to cancel his burst, right? So if the waves are like, if it's a lot of waves of pretty squishy enemies, then it's not going to feel that great to play Nahida in his team. But when you're dealing with non-multi-wave content, or content where the waves have a lot of HP so they like actually live through a whole rotation, then Sino becomes better if you have Nahida. Hytham, his best teams kind of generally use Nahida, but also if you don't have Nahida and you don't have a Dendro driver for your teams, and you want to play a team that requires a Dendro driver, then Hytham can fulfill that role, even if like it's not the main thing that he's good at. What are the general strengths and weaknesses of her kit? When compared with the other Dendro units that we have right now, we'll also have off-field Dendro applications. There's a separate question for head-to-head comparison per team archetype later. Okay, compared to Dendro main character, Pyro won't make her Dendro application just stop working, which is nice. Her range is virtually infinite. Once the enemies are marked, which you can mark them from very far away, they will stay marked for 25 seconds, and they will basically keep taking the thing, even if you just, like, they just run to Narnia, right? Like, you're not playing limited to a circle, which is nice. If you end up using her burst, she gives you a pretty sizable EM buff to your active character, right? Up to 250, which in some teams actually does a lot. Her application is constant. Your rotations usually last less than 25 seconds, meaning that you'll be able to reapply your E before your E expires on the enemy, which means that from the first time you press E, they will constantly take the Dendro with basically no downtime. Her Dendro application is 1.5 units rather than 1 unit, which generally doesn't matter that much because a lot of the interactions with the Dendro reactions, it doesn't really change anything if it's 1.5 over 1. But there are a few teams, namely Bloom teams, right? So with Nilo, where it matters a lot. There's burning teams where you can actually keep basically permanent burning on the enemies with 1.5 unit of Dendro, but you wouldn't be able to if it was 1. To some extent, Burgeon, because when you trigger burning in Burgeon, which you will sometimes unfortunately, it like takes away some of the Dendro aura, and if there's more, then that means that it might not take away too much. And it also obviously lets you potentially trigger more seeds. And I guess same for Hyper Bloom, but every time you trigger Quicken, it kind of doesn't matter because the strength of the Quicken aura is, in terms of like gauge units, the same as the strength of the weakest of the auras that triggered the Quicken reaction, or the weakest of the gauges that triggered the Quicken reaction, which means that it won't be a Quicken aura of 1.5U basically ever, right? It's always going to be 1U at most, unless you're using Beto, I guess. But if you're playing units that don't have that fast electro application, just like fast electro hits, stuff like Raiden, stuff like Kuki, sometimes your Dendro is going to be on the enemy and you won't trigger Quicken, and you'll get a Bloom before you trigger Quicken, and at that point you basically cheat out additional Blooms as well. It's not that huge of a deal, but it does make a difference here and there. And I guess last strength is the thing I mentioned earlier, that she's not that burst reliant. She still has her application even without burst. Weaknesses: in multi-wave content, she loses her application and you have to swap back into her, which when you play her with characters like Sino that don't want to be swapped out is not good. Because her Dendro application happens at the same time on all the enemies, if your Dendro ends up being the trigger for Bloom reactions, then that can end up leading to the seeds being generated all at the same time, which will meet the 2 seed limit. But generally you want her to be the aura and not the trigger, so that's not something that happens too often. What else would there be? Oh yeah, the 1.5 units can actually be a downside in some teams, where because you apply a lot of Dendro, it can make it harder to swirl the element you want, because when you're applying Dendro to a unit that has Electro on them, it can remove the Electro. And when you're applying a lot of Dendro, you can also apply underlying Dendro, which will make it impossible to reapply Electro for a little bit. And you'll have to work around that, which leads to rotations like having to be changed to accommodate for that sometimes, which is a pain in the ass. I guess I can show an example. Right, so if you do the same setup that you would be able to do with the other Dendro units, of starting with your Dendro, and then using Fischl, and then Kazuha, you can see that I didn't actually get a swirl, because Nahida's 1.5 units of Dendro prevented me from applying my Electro, and it prevented me from getting the Electro swirl. Now there are ways to work around that, and I want to make it very clear there are, but those ways, like, you have to know them, and it makes playing the teams more difficult. Basically, in this situation, what you'd have to do is, instead of just starting with Nahida's E, you start with Katsing's E before that. So you do this. And this time, I'm getting an Electro Swirl. Another thing that very much can happen in your teams, if you're not using an on-field electro unit, even if you get your initial electro swirl, it is very possible that with her dendro application, you end up losing the electro aura on the enemies and getting an underlying dendro, in which case an infusion won't swirl. And usually your animal units are built full EM, so their thing not swirling can be a pretty big loss in DPS, especially in AoE. I'll show it here so that we can actually like see it. I'm not gonna put Fischl in here just because I want it to be easy to see, and Fischl's gonna have too many numbers. It's not a thing that happens in this specific team generally, right? Because you have an on-field electro, but it is a thing that can be a possible weakness. So if we get our electro infusion, right? And we do this, right? We're not actually getting swirls. Oh, we got one on the last one there, but we didn't get one on the others. Let me show it again, but this time I'll keep attacking with Nahida to show that when you do that, you just don't actually get swirls at all after the initial one. Right? So we see aggravate, quicken, spread. Yep. Aggravate, quicken. Yep. Aggravate, quicken, spread. Yep. But no swirls on the other ones, right? Which again, in AoE can be a pretty big loss of damage because, especially when you can aggravate the swirls, it's a pretty reasonable portion of your team's DPS. Now, obviously, that won't always happen. That's not necessarily a big problem, but it is another potential weakness that she has over the other dendro units. Before we go further into her kit, can you briefly explain how she works first, since her E, Q, and A4 could be a bit confusing to newer players? Sure. Her E marks enemies. When enemies are marked, if you trigger a reaction on them, it will deal dendro damage up to once every 2.5 seconds, which can be a little bit faster when you use her burst. But basically, it deals coordinated damage when you trigger a reaction. Her burst basically improves her E. If you have pyro party members, it will make her E do more damage. If you have electro party members, it will make her E hit faster. And if you have a hydro party members, then the burst itself will last longer. So in other words, the pyro one doesn't do anything, the electro one is really good, and the hydro one can be good, but mostly if you already have the electro one. And her Ascension 4, she just gains damage based on her EM. But her Ascension 1 is she gives Elemental Mastery to the on-field character when her burst is active. And that's the use case of having only the Hydro bonus. It lasts longer and it doesn't improve the E at all, but it does give your on-field character more damage, or more EM, which generally, if you're playing a Bloom team, will be more damage. Can you get away with not bothering to level any of her talents at all? You can. I don't think you should because her E does reasonable damage, but I mean, sure, you can. Is her E or Q worth leveling first? It kind of depends, but generally it's the E. The E does a pretty, like I said, a pretty reasonable amount of damage. Now, in some teams, you care about the application more than you care about the damage itself. So you could argue for leveling the burst if you have Electro, so that it makes it faster, right? Because when you level up the burst, it also increases the E delay or the E timer reduction. But generally, it's E first and then burst. Is there any benefit to using her charge attacks? Yeah, her charge attacks have a separate ICD from her normal attacks. So if you're using her as a driver and you want more application, you can weave in some charge attacks. They also have some pretty cool mechanic where if you start holding the charge attack and then you swap out, it still very easily goes through. All right, if you dash, it easily goes through. Right, so if you're planning on swapping out of her, you can make an argument to use her charge attack right before you do, which helps with your dendro application, it helps with your AoE dendro application, it helps with finishing off enemies at the end of a rotation, stuff like that. But yeah, her as soon as you see the little thing, the animation thing here, right, the leaf, it means that the charge attack is going through, and no matter what you do, it is actually going to go all the way through. But yeah, usually if you're looking for highest possible or fastest possible on-field application, you'll generally want to do 1-2 charge attack, 1-2 charge attack. If you're going to be doing it for a while, but often you're going to be swapping out of her pretty often when you're playing her as an on-fielder because she can be played very quick swappy. So you mostly do stuff like 1-2-3-4 charge attack and then swap out, or 1-2 dash, 1-2 charge attack, swap out, stuff like that. The reason why you generally do 4 is because 3-hit ICD, so it gets you one more app. Alright, so you do 1-2 1-2 charge attack, swap out. These are like small ways of min-maxing your rotations that don't change that much, but they can help if you're like really close to being able to clear a chamber or you want to speedrun or something like that, but yeah. Something like an Aggravate, Baizhu, or Hyperbloom team, does she lose that much from not being level 90? I mean, in Aggravate teams, she definitely does, because in Aggravate teams, you're getting quicken uptime, and if you're getting quicken uptime, it means she's triggering spread, and if she's triggering spread, and she's not level 90, you lose a lot of damage out of that, right? Spread damage revolves around your level. Her E does not have ICD, so especially if you're playing her, whether you're playing her on-field or off-field, like a lot of her damage is going to be coming from that spread, so having her level 90 will be a pretty big deal. In Hyperbloom, it can matter as well, because in Hyperbloom you also can get spread, especially if you play her on-field, but you're not going to get as much, so it doesn't matter as much. In Baizhu, it matters a lot less, because you're not triggering spread. The only like transformative reaction that she's going to be proccing is generally going to be burning, which kind of sucks anyways, so level 90 or not, it's still going to suck. Off-field Nahida versus on-field Nahida. She can do both. She's generally the best off-fielder if you're not dealing with multi-wave content with stuff like a Sino team, but she's also generally one of the best on-fielders. Not necessarily the best on-fielder for quicken teams, right? In quicken teams, you'd want to play her more off-field than on-field, but definitely one of the best on-fielders for Baizhu and Hyperloop teams. And also a pretty good on-fielder for Nilo teams. Artifact set overview, Deepwood Gilded Instructor, or Flowers of Paradise Lost. What's her best 2-piece combination, and is it worth to force a bad 4-piece on her?
As usual, it depends.
If you're playing her in a team that does transformative damage, so Hyperbloom, Birds, and stuff like that, you want her on Deepwood, right? Because you want to have Deepwood on your team. If she's the only Dendro unit in an Aggravate team, though, there's not actually much of a difference between going Deepwood and going Gilded, because the res shred that you get from Deepwood is about as useful as the additional stats that you get from Gilded. Like, you'd still want to go Deepwood, but if you have a good Gilded, you can use that. If you're using her in Quicken teams and she's not leveled yet, you can use her on Instructor, I guess. But if she is leveled, generally, like, her damage matters enough that you'd rather go for either Deepwood or Gilded. But Instructor can still be fine if you don't have one of those sets farmed yet. And then Flowers of Paradise Lost is only good in Bloom teams, and even then, it's not that good. It's just okay. Generally, I just have her be the one on Deepwood in the Nilo teams and not think about it too much. She generally doesn't have that great ownership of the blooms in Nilo teams, so it's just like, it's not really what you want to be doing. Generally, you'd rather just have Deepwood on Nahida, and any other character that could be using Deepwood, you could probably be using them on Instructor instead, and that would generally be better. Thundering Fury Nahida, no, yes, maybe. Unfortunately, it really sucks. Most of her E's value lies in her E staying on the field and having the effect that, you know, keeps reapplying Dendro, and it doesn't apply it, like, that part of it doesn't get increased by using TF. So TF Nahida, unfortunately, not the tech. Not the tech, unfortunately. Artifact stat overview. Okay, the TLDR of it is, honestly, it really doesn't matter. Two things to keep in mind. One, if you're above 1000 EM, it's probably worth to replace one of your EM pieces for something else. And two, have fun. Right, so on the Sense, generally she wants to go EM. On the Goblet, she can go EM or Dendro damage. And on the Circlet, she can go EM or crit. The difference in output between all of those combinations is somewhat minor, to the point where generally, there are some exceptions, but generally, if you just use your artifact with the best substats, it's gonna be the one that performs better. Usually your artifact with the best substats will not be the EM one, because EM Circlets are rarer than crit Circlets, and EM Goblets can't roll EM substat, whereas Dendro Goblets can roll EM substats, so your average quality will be slightly higher, right? But average is cool and all, but there's a lot of people that play this game to the point where there's going to be a lot of people that don't get the average result. It's very possible that you have a better EM Goblet than a Dendro Goblet, or a better EM Circlet than a Dendro Circlet. One thing that you want to, you don't necessarily need, but you do like, is making sure that at least one member of your team has 1000 EM. If her burst, like her EM buff from her burst, is something that you care about. So if your on-field unit is going to be triggering reactions, you would like for there to be one unit in your team that has 1000 EM. And if that's not the case, then that would be an argument in favor of putting her on EM main stats on everything, so that you get closer to the 1000 EM cap on her Ascension 1. Yeah, in most teams, that's pretty easy to do, because in Aggravate teams, you're gonna have an Animo unit that's gonna be at least close to that amount lot of EM. In Nilo teams, your Hydro units want to be building a lot of EM. In Hyperbloom teams, your Electro unit wants to be building a lot of EM. In Burgeon team, your Pyro units wants to be building a lot of EM. So usually, it's not that difficult, and Nahida doesn't need to be the one that actually gets that maxed out. You don't need to reach the EM cap, you just don't want to go above it. Basically, if you're not at 1000 EM, EM is about as good as Script. If you are at 1000 EM or higher, EM is not ideal. There are often ways for Nahida to gain EM that aren't going to show up in the stats themselves. So right, if you're using Gilded Dreams, that's up to 150 EM. That's not going to show up on your stat page. If Nahida is the highest EM in your party, then if you're at 1000 EM and you get 250 more from using her burst, then you're over 1000, and that's not necessarily ideal. It's not the end of the world because it does mean that you're getting more EM, but like you could make an argument to go for like stop at 800 so that you gain 200 from it and you actually reach the 1000 like cap on your A4. Basically, the amount of EM that like would cap out your thing depends a lot on the like dynamic buffs that you have in your teams. So just keep that in mind and remember not to overcap the passive too much, because then you'd be missing out on some damage. Weapon overview. How do all her weapon choices stack up against each other in an off-field and on-field role? And what are her good free-to-play options and perhaps your own personal recommendations given the variety that she has at her disposal? Okay, so good talk. Basically, because a pretty significant portion of her damage comes from her EM scaling, the base attack on the weapon doesn't matter that much. Now, her personal damage in teams is relevant, but it generally won't be the majority of the team's damage, which means that those two things put together make Fav an actual pretty reasonably good option for her. Personally, my Nahida is 100% always on Favonius, unless someone else needs Favonius. That being said, it's not always the best option, it's just I'm too lazy to change weapons, and I kind of just CBA. And there are definitely other options that are just as good, so in some cases slightly worse, in some cases slightly better, in some cases a lot better. Because at the end of the day, there are still quite a few teams where she doesn't actually care about her burst that much, so if you don't get your burst, that's not the end of the world. In teams where you need, or you really want to use your burst, so you look at stuff like Sino teams, where not using your burst would be a pretty big damage loss because Sino really wants that EM buff, like the Razor Thundering Fury team, where not getting that 250 EM would make a pretty big difference. Any teams like that where you really care about the EM buff, you absolutely want to get enough ER. And while Nahida can generate a pretty high amount of energy overall, right? She generates 3 particles when her E procs, up to once every 8 seconds, which means that if your rotation is 24 seconds or longer, that's 9 particles per rotation. And if we look at the amount of energy that generates, even if she doesn't catch any of it, if you actually get 3 procs per rotation, you get like a whatever average particle generation from the rest of your team. So in that Thundering Fury team that I was mentioning, right, you're gonna have a Razor. Let's say Razor's not on Fav for now, so you're getting like 3 from 1 Razor E, because the rest of your Razor E's happen in his burst, if you even use them, but she doesn't catch them. You're gonna get Bennett, who's gonna get 2 E's maybe, and you're gonna get Singso, who gets 1 E. If your Singso is on Fav, that gives you a total of reasonably high, but once you start getting, I mean, if you give her Fav, that already instantly fixes it, which is part of why I like Fav a lot in this team. But this is not a team that generates a lot of particles. Well, if she catches, right, if you use EQ while you have an off-field ability or after setting up something, then you can actually catch your own particles during your burst animation, right? That already helps quite a bit. If you use Razor on Fav instead of Singto, then that can be up to like 2 additional Fav procs if you have a high Fav refine, right? Which brings us to 11, where ER basically becomes a joke. If you look at other teams where you could be using her, so for example, the Kutsing Aggravate team with Kazuha and Favonius, right? Already your ER requirements are basically nothing. Oh yeah, I forgot Kutsing E's, right? You basically don't have ER requirements in a team like this. But yeah, in teams like that, you don't really need the energy on the other characters either, because Kutsing is generating so much, along with Fischl and the Electro Resonance. And so it kind of just like doesn't do anything to go Fav, so in teams like that, you'd rather go for something else, right? But what is something else? Well, at a baseline is the Magic Guide. Magic Guide is generally not a good weapon because, well, it's a 3-star weapon. So the amount of stats that it has is pretty bad. But it's not a high base attack 3-star weapon. The substat is really good for Nahida, and the passive in some teams is also really good for Nahida. Specifically in that Kutsing team that I mentioned, the passive does a lot, right? It's just 24 free damage % on basically everything. And because she doesn't care about the base attack that much, because she has EM scalings that are additive with the attack scalings, then the Magic Guide actually ends up being the like a baseline free-to-play option. You can go for Witzith, which is going to be significantly better when the buff is active, no matter what buff it is, even the attack % one, but also not that great when the buff is not active. It averages out to be a bit better, but one thing that doesn't reflect in just averages when it comes to stuff like Witzith is just how much it can matter, like in some situations, to have all that damage be front-loaded. Now, obviously, the attack buff is a lot worse than the damage buff and the EM buff on her. And also, especially if you have the R5 Witzith, the EM buff can be 480, which means that you can max out your Ascension bonus with not that much EM, but you don't want to run like 0 EM in case you hit the EM buff. So you're kind of gonna end up overcapping if you get the EM buff, but if you don't get the EM buff, you don't want to go 500 less EM just in case you don't hit the EM buff, whatever. Point being, the randomness of the passive is a bit of a downside, but when your passive is up, it's her best weapon. Like, it's better than the 5-star options, but it has pretty long downtime. If you can front load enemies, if you're trying to speedrun, it's really good. But even if you're not trying to speedrun, being able to front load your damage is always an upside. If you do all your damage in the first 10 seconds of your rotation, versus if you take 20 seconds to do all your damage at a consistent pace, it means that if the enemy has, let's say you do 1 million damage in each rotation. If you do 1 million damage in your first 10 seconds and then 0 damage after, that means that if the enemy has, let's say, 1.8 million HP, then you have 10 seconds where you do 1 million, then 10 seconds where you do 0, and then another 10 seconds where you would do another million, but it only ends up taking 8 seconds to kill the enemy, for a total of 28 seconds total, right? Whereas if it's consistent damage over time, 20 seconds to do 1 million, and then to do 800, you would need another 16 seconds to do another 800k, for a total of 36 seconds total instead. So the same amount of DPS, if sustained instead of front-loaded, would lead to a slower clear. So even if the Witzith average is at a specific point, in practice, because enemies have a finite amount of health, and when they're dead, you move on, you don't just stay there, then that makes weapons like Witzith perform a little bit better in practice than they would in a typical weapon comparison. All in all, Witzith is generally her best 4-star option. Sack Frag is also a good 4-star option just because low base attack, high substat, and it's a substat that's good. It's generally not as good as Witzith, but not everyone has Witzith. Solar Pearl generally is not that great because you don't want to have to swap back into her, but if you do end up on-fielding her, it's a pretty solid option. Prototype Amber, if you end up using her in teams where you don't have a healer, can actually be fine because like we said earlier, right? Because she doesn't scale with the attack that much, it doesn't matter that much to use like a 4-star weapon instead of a 5-star or stuff like that. Now, obviously, using a weapon that has a substat that you don't use feels like shit, and you don't want to do it. But if you don't have a healer and you're struggling to stay alive, it is a thing that you can do. It's probably not something that I would do like ever, but it does make your clears more comfortable, and it does also help with your ER if you're playing her in a team where you need the energy. Mapamare is okay, but generally, at least if you're off-field, worse than Magic Guide. One thing that I didn't mention for Magic Guide earlier, the damage percent passive is only there if the opponent is affected by Hydro or Electro. Now, if you're playing her off-field in a Quicken team and stuff like that, that's pretty easy. They're almost always going to be affected by Electro, and the times where they won't be affected by Electro, it's because your E just hit them, which means it won't hit again until you affect them with Electro again, right? So you wouldn't really lose any uptime on this passive. However, if you end up on-fielding her or playing her in a team that isn't a Quicken team, it's very possible that your Hydro or Electro uptime on the enemy ends up being lower, and you don't actually get as much value out of this passive. Now, if that's the case, then that can lower the value of weapons like Magic Guide in comparison to the other free-to-play options that you could have, like Mapamare, or I guess Fruit of Fulfillment if you need the ER. Other than that, you can consider Hakushin if you need the ER and you end up playing her in like a quick swappy, like quicken team or something like that, generally not the best option. And you have Wandering Even Star that's up there with Widsith as like one of her best options. It's a bit less damage than Widsith, but it gives an attack buff to the rest of your team, which can be valuable, especially at high refines. However, this is a weapon banner exclusive 4-star weapon, which means that most people won't have it, or at least have it at high refine, in which case you don't need it at all. It's not a weapon that's anywhere near necessary. When it comes to 5-star options, honestly, her signature's kind of bait. Like, it's not bad per se. It's also not great. It gives 40 EM to the rest of your team, which is like cool and all, but weirdly enough, it only goes to 48 at R5, which like I really don't understand. That's such a weird thing to do. It's an upside. Wait, you're right. I never noticed this. This is just an Aranara. Most signature weapons are like actually significantly above the other 5-star options. 1000 Floating Dreams is not. Especially if you end up playing her off-field or quick swap. Kagura is generally about as good because basically all of her damage comes from her skill, so the weapon that focuses on skill damage is very good for her. The other 5-star catalysts are fine, but generally I wouldn't go for them over the other options mentioned earlier, unless like you're playing on field, then you could use Lost Prayers, I guess. It's not bad, but eh. All in all, like, she has a lot of weapons that work well on her, and she has a lot of different teams that would like different types of weapons, right? A lot of her teams you would like to use Fav, a lot of her teams you'd like to use like a damage weapon, some teams you'd like to use a prototype Amber, and when it comes to damage weapons, sometimes Magic Guide can be good, sometimes it's a little bit less good because you're not getting Electro uptime, but like all in all, there's a lot of good weapons for her. Yeah, and the Fruit of Fulfillment is fine if you need the ER. But generally, if you need the ER, if you have Fav, I'd probably go for that instead. I would say that if you don't have Kagura's or 1000 Floating Dreams, if I were to choose between a High Refined Widsith and a Lost Prayers, even for on-field, I'd probably go for the Widsith, even if I think it cheats a little bit lower. Constellation overview. How's her Constellation quality across the board? How strong is her C2 relative to something like Raiden or Yelan's? Does her C1 actually do much? And how does her C6 compare to those of other 5-star units? Okay, Constellation 1. When the Shrine of Maya, which is her burst, is unleashed, and the elemental types of the party members are being tabulated, the count will add a 1 to the number of Pyro, Electro, and Hydro characters respectively. If you're playing an Aggravate team, this makes her E do a bit more damage, and it makes her burst last a bit longer, which is nice. It's not massive, but it's a little useful, I guess, increase. If you're playing a Hyper Bloom team with only 1 Electro unit, it also makes it a little bit faster. If you're playing a Virgin team, it makes it a little bit faster. All in all, you can look at Nahida's C1 very similarly to what you'd think about something like Raiden's C1, where like, it's useful, but it generally doesn't do that much. The biggest like jump increase that you get from any of the like parts of her burst is the skill, like the Electro one, going from 0 to 1. So if you're playing her in Nilo teams or in Virgin teams that don't run an Electro unit, her C1 is somewhat decent. Outside of those teams, her C1 is generally kind of a joke. But even in those teams, it's really like, it's not worth going for. You have other things that are better to get. I'm pretty sure that's intentional, right? A lot like they did with Raiden's C1. They gave a C1 that like is a little bit convoluted, so you're not quite sure how good it is, so you might end up going for it, and then you actually realize that it doesn't do anything, and then you realize that you're closer to her C2, which is actually really good. And you're like, oh, well, since I'm already there, I might as well keep going. Don't get baited, okay? If you want to go for her C2, I'm not going to stop you. But if you're not planning on going for her C2, don't feel like you have to because you're already at C1. Nahida's C2 is quite good. It makes it so that all the transformative Dendro reactions have a 20% chance to crit for double damage, which is 20% increased damage. It also means that when you're triggering Quicken or Aggravate or Spread, but any Quicken reactions, you're reducing enemies' defense by 30%. When you're playing an Abyss, character level is 90, and on the last floor, on the last chamber, enemy level is 100. Your damage multiplier is your level plus 100 divided by your level plus 100 plus the enemy's level plus 100 multiplied by 1 minus whatever defense reduction you have. So without any damage defense reduction, all your damage is basically divided by 2 multiplied by 48%. With 30% damage reduction, instead of being multiplied by 48%, instead of doing 48% of your pre-mitigation damage, you do 57. In other words, you're doing about 18% more damage. So basically, we can round it to 20. Her C2 makes your team do 20% more damage through their Bloom transform or their Dendro transformative reactions and just their damage if you trigger Quicken or Aggravate. It's a 20% team-wide DPS increase. That's basically it. Yeah, except in teams that do a lot of talent damage but don't use Electro. That's actually quite good. Apart from some of the personal damage increases on hyper carries, like for example, Raiden's C2 that increases her personal damage by 44%. And if you play her in a hyper carry team, her personal damage is most of your team's damage, so that increase of 44% in personal damage is like 30-ish% team DPS increase. But like hyper carry cons aside, this is about as good as it gets for like low level cons. But like I said earlier, it's meant to bait you, right? Like it's a good constellation, and again, if you care about getting constellations, you can go for that. But a good way to think about this is constellations are basically the same thing as 5-star weapons. 5-star weapons are like constellations. They effectively do the same thing. A constellation and a 5-star weapon have the same purpose, and it's to, at least when it comes to constellations like these, it's to increase the total amount of damage that you do without really changing playstyle in any way by using a new character or a new mechanic. It makes the number that you're already doing bigger. If that's what you want, which is completely fine, then this is something that you can consider. If, when I explain it like that, you think, I guess that doesn't do that much then maybe consider not going for a constellation like this. Nahida's teams are more than good enough without the C2. C3 is skill levels. It's nice, like it's useful, but it doesn't do that much. Like it's cool, it increases your damage. If you end up playing her in Quicken teams though, a lot of your damage comes from the spread, so this isn't as big of an increase. And if you end up playing her in non-Quicken teams, then she's generally not that big of a portion of your team's DPS, so it's still not that big of an increase. A C4, I mean that's a C4. I don't know what it is about C4s on 5 stars, but they always suck. Most of the time, they're useful, but really, really minor. This increases her EM by up to 160, which is like, it's nice. Her C5 is kind of a useless garbage piece of shit. Like it makes your reduction go from at like 2 electro, it's reduced by 0.6. It goes to 0.7. The increase from Pyro goes from 25 to 29. Ooh, 4 damage percent. The trigger interval is also useful, but at that point, it's like almost, it's barely not noticeable at that point. The duration increase from the Hydro one is potentially noticeable if it helps your rotations line up better though. So in some teams you might notice it a little, but generally her C5 is kind of useless. And then her C6 is overall like it's strong. Obviously, it's kind of like Elan C6 but Dendro. Effectively does kind of the same thing as Elan C6. Overall, it's good, but just like C2, it's overkill. You don't need this for her to be good. Her C6, I would say, is definitely among the better ones for the 5-star units. Okay, team overview. What are some examples of archetypes that Nahida performs best in, and which teams do I think are Nahida's best? Does she have any wacky, off-meta, non-Dendro teams worth a try, and can you do a quick rundown of how her team's rotations would generally look like? Let's start with this question. Any wacky, off-meta, non-Dendro teams? She's Dendro. What the f are you talking about? How do you play a non-Dendro team with Nahida? But we can talk about wacky off-meta teams, but they will be Dendro because, you know, she's Dendro. The thing about Nahida teams is she works in every Dendro archetype, and there is a heck of a lot of Dendro archetypes. I did a bunch of different videos on a bunch of different Dendro archetypes, and I didn't even end up doing it on every archetype because I kind of just got burnt out because there's just so many of them. But we can do a short list of them, right? You've got the baseline Quicken reaction, which leads to Aggravate or spread-focused teams. Now, obviously, Aggravate teams still use spread, and spread teams still use Aggravate, but there are definitely teams that focus more on the Aggravate side and teams that focus more on the spread side. Generally, the spread teams are more Alhaitham teams, whereas the Quicken teams are more like Kuting or Yai, stuff like that. But we can separate them between the two. Aggravate, spread, because you generally care about different kinds of units on the team, right? In the spread-focused teams, generally, you don't really want to use Fischl because you won't be able to maintain an Electro Aura, so you're not gonna get Quicken being triggered by your Dendro character. It'll be triggered by your off-field Electro, which means that the only reaction that your on-field Dendro character would trigger would be Spread, which is not an Electro reaction, so it wouldn't trigger Fischl's Ascension 4, which is half her damage in Quicken teams. So she'd be half as useful, which, you know, opens the door for different types of units instead. If you don't keep Electro Aura on the enemy, and if you're not using multiple Electro units, then there's less value in using an animal character, because without the Electro Aura, like I showed earlier, their swirls aren't actually going to happen, or at least are going to happen less often. And with less Electro characters to benefit from the VV, then that's, again, right, less incentive to run an animal unit. So in those teams, you're more incentivized to run different types of units. But Nahida's really good in both archetypes, right? She's good in Aggravate teams as the solo Dendro. However, if you do use her in Aggravate focus teams as the Dendro unit, generally that means that you're not going to have a healer, because Fischl is just so good in those Aggravate focus teams, so you don't want to replace her. You want some Electro or Animal on-fielder to be who triggers Fischl's A4 and obviously triggers Aggravate themselves. But yeah, and you ideally would like your animal unit to be one that has grouping and buffs, right? Someone like Kazuhara Sucrose. You don't want to be forced into using Sayu or Jean instead. And that leaves you with one slot left for Nahida, and if you put Nahida in there, it's hard to fit a healer, right? You'd have to either replace your on-fielder with someone like Cookie, for example, which you can do, but generally kind of feels like shit. Or you can replace your Fischl with Cookie, which also kind of feels like shit. Or you can replace your grouper with for Sayu or Jean, which also kind of feels like shit. Or you can use Nahida on Prototype Amber. You got a bunch of options. She's still very good in the teams, but she's like far from being like the only option that you can go for. In spread teams, I guess I'd argue that she's a bit better, because generally when you're focused more on spread, that means you're running 2 Dendro units. And if you're running 2 Dendro units, probably like Alhaitham Nahida or something like that. Nahida gives a lot of energy generation for Alhaitham to have low ER requirements. She also has a lot of personal damage and a pretty massive EM buff, which Alhaitham benefits a lot from. So I'd say that she performs a little bit better in the spread teams than the Aggravate teams. Not that she's bad in the Aggravate teams, just that she has, I guess, more synergy what spread teams want to do than what Aggravate teams want to do. Then you've got all the Bloom sub-archetypes. So baseline, you've got Bloom, but Bloom by itself isn't a real thing. So you've got like Bountiful Bloom with Nilo. I mean, she's not necessary, but there's definitely a pretty big difference between Nilo teams that use Nahida and Nilo teams that don't. The main thing that she does, right, is with her 1.5U Dendro, she makes it a lot easier for you to consistently get the same characters being the trigger. So it's a lot easier to keep Dendro as the aura and have Hydro be the element that triggers the reaction, either by going triple Hydro and on-fielding Nahida, or going double Hydro, double Dendro, and then most of your reactions will be triggered by your Hydro units, which makes it easier to like build your characters properly. And also just triggering Bloom with Hydro, it doesn't remove all the aura, right? It only removes 0.5 units of Dendro, and especially with her 1.5 unit application, which actually applies 1.2 after tax, but whatever. It lets you basically get like really good consistency in who triggers the reactions and get as many Bloom reactions as possible. Next up, the Hyper Bloom archetypes. So we've got baseline, just like normal Hyper Bloom. In normal Hyper Bloom, well, she has the best Dendro application, which means that she generally enables the highest ceilings for Hyper Bloom teams. Either as an on-fielder or as an off-fielder, she can be really good. All in all, just a pretty strong team for her. Hyper Bloom also has its own set of sub-archetypes, right? You've got Hyper Fridge, where you do a Hyper Bloom team and you use a Cryo unit. The Cryo unit helps maintain your Dendro application by making it so that when you apply Hydro onto a unit that has Cryo and Dendro on them, it removes less Dendro. And it freezes them, so it makes the teams easier to play. Because generally in those teams, right, your Electro application is pretty slow, so you're not actually gonna break the freeze with your Electro very much. And you'll overall just like get decent freeze up time on top of getting a bit more seeds. Now, Nahida generally doesn't need Hyper Fridge to help with her seed generation because she generally applies enough Dendro by herself, but obviously the freeze is always, if you're against freezable enemies, it's always something that can help a lot. You have Salad. Salad is the archetype where Nahida actually, I guess, has the worst synergy. The idea behind the Salad archetypes is you play a Hyper Bloom team, but instead of having your Electro unit be the trigger, you have an Electro unit that doesn't trigger the seeds too often, and that can apply Electro onto the enemy. And with that, you use an Animal unit to swirl that electro that's on the enemy onto the seeds to trigger the hyper bloom. That way you can build your electro unit with their normal damage build and your animo unit with their normal EM build, and you still get all of those hyper blooms with the EM. That's the general idea behind Salad. Now, Salad can work with Nahida, but especially when you start to get in single target situations, Nahida's stronger Dendro application with the 1.5 units can actually be enough to make Salad teams a lot harder to pilot and a lot less consistent, because you're gonna have electro on the enemy a lot less often, so it'll be harder to swirl it onto the seeds. When you're in AoE, the way that swirl aura works is a little bit weird, but basically you can think of it like this. When you're in AoE and you swirl electro, the electro that you swirled onto the new enemy is stronger than the baseline electro you started with. Which means that when you're in AoE, the stronger Dendro application from Nahida doesn't matter as much because your electro is also stronger. But when you're in single target, you don't have that interaction, and your like swirls, instead of spreading and strengthening your electro aura, can weaken the electro aura, which all in all just makes Nahida a little bit less versatile in the Salad teams. So probably the archetype that I would at least try to make work with Nahida, but it obviously can still work, and especially in AoE situation, it's still really, really good. I guess I should probably show the archetype in action. And this Abyss is actually perfect to show it because there's AoE followed by single target.
Your coming was foretold.
Right, so as you can see, quite solid when you're in AoE. Yeah. I guess this enemy is a little too squishy to show how it can fall short in single target, so I'll show it against the Primo Bishop. Right, so here for a little bit, right? We ended up not having an Electro Aura for a bit. Obviously, the team is still strong because the units that make the team are really, really strong. And if you do your rotations right, you're still gonna get decent Electro uptime, but it is just a thing to potentially keep in mind that it can be a bit of a problem. Personally, I prefer running Dendro main character over Nahida in this team. Next up, Virgin baseline. She obviously works pretty well in. Her application is really good. And honestly, all the Virgin sub-archetypes as well, right? So you look at, I'm not gonna fucking bother listing them all, but she works pretty well in all of them. On top of that, you can also go for her in like Burn Melt teams. She's the only Dendro unit that works actually well in Burn Melt because her 1.5U Dendro basically means that you can maintain pseudo-permanent burning uptime. Now, I don't have Ganyu on this account, so I can't show it all that well. I mean, I have a video on it. You can go check it out if you'd like. Or if you manage your stuff properly, you don't have to swap back to your pyro unit or to have an off-field pyro application, and you can melt all of your charge shots with Ganyu. And she's the only Dendro unit that can do that due to her 1.5 unit Dendro. And then I guess finally you've got Air Fryer, which is a team that focuses on burning damage and swirl damage as its like main form of damage. This team sucks in single target, but because you're effectively triggering permanent burning on the whole chamber, because Nahida's E can maintain burning on all the enemies all the time, it means that when you're against annoying chambers where there's a lot of enemies that are hard to group or something like that, you can play Air Fryer teams and it won't clear that fast, but as long as the enemy's not too tanky, like no matter how annoying they are, you'll clear them in about the same amount of time, right? Now obviously, this is like precisely the kind of content that's good for this. Gotta be careful not to die though. Because one of the issues with burning is that it deals damage to your character if you stand too close to the enemies. So if I trigger the burning and then I stand in the middle of the enemies, I almost died through Bennett Burst. Honestly, you should be able to die through Bennett Burst. If I go on Nahida and keep refreshing the burning, you can actually die to your own to your own. I kind of got hit by them as well, though, there. So I feel like it doesn't really count. But you get the idea. You do a lot of damage to yourself. It's funny. Generally, the team's not very good, but I mean, it's a meanie thing that you can do with her. But yeah, that kind of covers the teams. Speaking of Aggravate, does Nahida's damage output compensate for the slightly increased difficulty in getting Electro Swirl in that team? If you play it right, it does generally, yes. But it's not just the difficulty in getting an Electro Swirl, it's also generally playing Nahida means you're not playing a healer. And if you are playing a healer, then you're downgrading another slot to get an upgrade on your Dendro slot, and that might not actually be worth it. Especially if you actually add the difficulty of getting the Electro Swirls into it. Does she have good synergy with Baizhu? I wouldn't say that she has any particular synergy with Baizhu. I guess she can like make up for Baiju's weakness, which is his AoE application, by herself having pretty good AoE application. And like you'll probably see her in teams with Baizhu, but I don't think it's anything like particularly synergistic, no. Does team DPS increase when she says everyone hold hands? It's not that it increases when she said everyone hold hands, it's that it decreases when she says something else. Lastly, can you do some of her voice lines in both EN and Japanese? Oh my, okay, I'll try, but honestly, no promises for this one. Hey! Make yourselves at home! This might hurt a little. The Temple of Wisdom! Committed to memory. Sharing my knowledge. 覚えたわよ。知識はあなたにの。Everyone hold hands!